So I'm Katrina Novakowic. I work for Red Hat in London. I'm a business architect, and I focus on helping customers to strategically use open source software and principles and methodologies.
Hi, my name is Ed Seymour. I am our lead for container adoption at Red Hat. So my container adoption personal journey started about in 2015 when Red Hat released OpenShift 3, which was the first enterprise distribution of Kubernetes. So I've been working with our customers and partners since then, trying to help them figure out how to adopt containers and then get them working and delivering the most benefit within their organizations. I don't know if you've seen this. I'd expect you'd have seen this already a few times, maybe if you'd been in the Kubernetes one. But this kind of is from a Dilbert comic coming around last week. This sort of kind of embodies some of the challenges that we're having with container adoption, in that people think that it's just the technology. And so what we're going to talk about today in our talk is kind of how it isn't really just the technology. There's a whole bunch of other things that we need to think about. It doesn't mean that we need to kind of do a sort of waterfall implementation. We're able to kind of deliver value very quickly, but you do need to kind of think about the sorts of things that you're going to change before you launch ahead and start working on it.
So what we're going to look at today, we're going to start with the why. Why is there a need for digital transformation? Why are we looking at new platforms and new technologies? Who's affected by the change, and what do they need to do the change? What exactly is changing? What do we need to change? And spoiler alert, it's not just the technology. How? We're looking at the strategy of what needs to be done to deliver the change. And then also, who actually does the change, and then looking at how we can measure the change and ensure that we continually improve. So we've been having a lot of conversations with different customers within different organizations and industries, and all of them kind of have different reasons for why they're doing business transformation. They kind of have these different approaches and different perspectives of why they want to do it, and they put into it different amounts of investment and also different amounts of disruption that they're able to cope with. So, for example, if you look at IT optimization, this is about whether you want to migrate an app and do kind of rehosting it onto a new platform, all the way into application development, which is more kind of significant disruption, where you might want to look at all of the processes along the software lifecycle journey.
So interesting. So hands up if you're in app dev, so you're doing software development in here. Just a few people. Operations, so you're running apps and operations. Anyone having to like plug in hardware and do infrastructure? Oh, no, we've lost those guys. Yeah. So we get those conversations from all those sort of different sectors, and what's interesting, we have to talk to them and see how we're able to basically help drive some value. And so what we typically find is if we talk to the infrastructure guys, they're saying, how do we make that job more effective for them? How can they be more efficient? With the cloud, they're looking to drive towards cloud, then how do we make that more efficient? How do we automate all of these sorts of processes? And then with application development, we're looking at that full software development lifecycle. But actually in practice, if you're running IT, then you're running some kind of service in production. And it doesn't matter whether you've bought that off the shelf or you have gone to a third party to go and build you an application, or you're actually building IT internally and running that internally. Either way, you've still got to go through that process of delivering that software into production. What we find is that they, depending on those sorts of conversations that we've got, they've kind of got a different idea about what they're going to do. And often we'll see, if we just rehost, so we just put some new infrastructure in there and we can rehost our applications, then that's not going to disrupt our business very much. But the challenge is if they're not disrupting their ways of working and their approaches, then they may not be able to drive as much value in that business. And actually, we've run studies with companies that have gone through this process. So Forrester did this study for us and looked at a number of companies that had gone through that transformation and container adoption. And they found that, yes, if you improve the platform, you can get about 20% benefit from your operational overhead, so you can make applications easier to deliver and things like that. But if you're not focusing on the app dev side of things and the software delivery side of things, then you're sort of losing a big chunk of the pie, around about 60% on, or 80% rather, on actually what you're able to deliver. One of the key things that we've had is that utilization, so improvements in utilization. So we typically don't find that companies get really much significant improvement in the utilization of their hardware, going from a sort of traditional app dev to container-based app dev. The utilization tends to be very small. And I've had organizations talk to me and say, well, look, we've gone from VMs to containers, but we still have the same number of VMs underneath it. And the reason why that is because we're actually doing much more with that work. And we're able to, do ad hoc testing and automated our testing and create and do actually more work with those servers. So whilst the numbers of servers haven't changed, we're doing much better work with them.
And Red Hat carried out a survey with a number of organisations. I think it's about 1,500, and they're not all Red Hat customers, so a vast mixture of organisations. And we looked at where they were on their kind of digital transformation journey and also what their priorities were. And we found that those starting at the journey had their priorities and were focusing on cost efficiency and the ways of working. And then as you move further along the journey, once they've solved these problems, they were focusing more on the user experience and innovation, so really getting that promise of delivery from digital journeys. So basically, innovation becomes more important as you move into the journey across it.
So we use this as a technique then for help organizations apply a strategy. So what we would initially talk to an organization, so obviously they may be wanting to do some greenfield work, and that's fine, but there's actually normally a lot of applications that they've got that they can improve. But you can't simply just improve an application by containerizing it. We need to go through this process. So typically we work with them to help package and abstract their infrastructure, so they essentially take their applications, containerize them, and get them adopted onto the platform. So they're essentially still the same application, but really the only things that we've improved is maybe the delivery, performance, and the operational overhead. And once we're in that position, it's easier for us to help modernize those applications, and so we can then look at a cycle of improvement around modernizing those applications. And then once we feel that we're starting to do that, we start then emerging more agile and DevOps-like principles within those teams and be able to drive greater innovation within the work that they're doing.
So when you introduce new technology, it has an impact on all of the organisational structure, and that includes the people and the processes aspects as well. So if you've got a new piece of technology, you have to really consider the business reasons, the business case of why you're having it. And this also includes, for example, if you're introducing some technology that might help for modernisation efforts, the real value might not be in the technology itself, but in the people and the processes and the changes you have in those areas.
Yeah, so quite often when we first started out, we had customers who going, oh, well, we'll just buy OpenShift from you, Kubernetes, and they'd install it, and then be like, well, how do we actually get people using it? And you'd get one or two pilot applications on there, but they weren't able to kind of really get enough momentum within that. And it's, in building these platforms, you need to work in lockstep with the app teams and the development teams and how they work in order to be able to get the most out of it. You can't just simply go and install some software and have that sort of field of dreams moment where you expect everyone is going to come flocking and start using it. And so when we started looking at this, so I get lots of people come up to me and they say, how do I containerize this app? How can we have some special automated tool that's going to take my application and containerize it? I go, well, we could, but really containerizing applications in many cases isn't that difficult. The hard bit is all the other stuff that we need to look at. Is the architecture right? So is it going to enable us to scale dynamically in a platform like Kubernetes? What are the dependencies like? Are we going to break dependencies if we move it from its current place to its new place? The dev tooling and things like that, are we going to improve that? How are we going to align the dev tooling to the platform and make use out of those tools the best way possible? Operational tooling is probably the most disruptive. So if you look at, even if I just take, say, like I have a Tomcat application, so nice and simple, and then I put that into Kubernetes, so I containerize and put it in Kubernetes, really don't need to make any changes to that application. That's super simple. We can do that really quickly. So we may change the application and we can create a container and we can do that, and that'll take us 5 minutes. But all of the operational processes will change. So none of the ways that you do updates, to apply new patches, monitor that application, check the application's logs, the way that you're going to do failover if there's a problem, the way that you do load balancing across multiple sites, all of those things are all going to change. And so from an operational perspective, you need to consider that. And then finally, from the software development lifecycle, of that kind of governance that goes across that, is the business actually going to get in the way with outdated governance models and release management processes that are going to block you and stop you from being able to deliver quickly? And so we need to look at all of those things in the round and come up with a better solution for that organization.
So where do we start? There's value in moving away from the complex legacy systems that we have, but this brings about disruptive changes within the organization, and that also means that your organization should significantly invest as well into it. So how do you go about doing these changes? Oh, the other slide.
That's all right.
How do you go about doing these changes? You throw me off now. Rather than taking a big bang approach, we recommend that you do incremental steps where you're kind of understanding what you're working on and then making course correction changes as you go along. And it's also important to measure things, and we recommend that you measure the business outcome as you go along. So a business outcome might be when you've got an application that's gone live into production. And so what we recommend is that you perform small measurable steps as you go along.
So that may seem like a bit of a moonshot, being able to do that. But what we found that works successfully with our customers is to go through this sort of incremental process. So the first thing that we do is help them understand the current application landscape. So yes, they may be wanting to completely reimagine some of their applications to do greenfield work, but we do see a lot of value in some cases for certain applications to be modernized and put onto the platform. We also need to understand the organization's capabilities as well. And so, where are they in their DevOps journey, for example? Have they implemented SRE? How do we align that with the sorts of capabilities that we're expecting from teams in order to become truly cloud native? And then based on that, we can then kind of set direction, understand what the priorities are in terms of the business and the people and its capabilities, and to be able to set a kind of a roadmap then of certain increments. And as Kat was saying, each increment we want to look and focus on driving some business outcome. So being able to, as we say, get applications in production, very important. And then once we've established those patterns, we're then able to use those patterns to be able to scale out across the rest of the business. So one of the tools that we use, this is an open source tool. It's not a Red Hat product. It's just something that our consultants came up with and started work on. So we've got this application tool called Pathfinder. So it's a web-based tool. And the idea is that you run this application, this tool within your environment. So normally on a Kubernetes environment. And that developers are able then to go to this website that it presents and basically enter details about their application. And the reason that we do it this way is that we ask a straightforward set of questions about their application, its architecture, the way they develop it, the way of working, the way the team works. And so we get an idea about how that particular application is managed and run within that organization. And then based on that, we're able to come up with sort of a kind of a risk assessment on that application to understand which applications are going to be harder for us to migrate and containerize than other applications. So sometimes we find that applications are going to be super easy and we can move them across, and other times we need to do a bit more work. And then ultimately what we do is we aggregate all of the applications that you survey, and then we can help managers then identify which applications they might want to look at first. So which ones are kind of going to drive business value, what sort of changes they're going to make to them, and which ones require certain amounts of effort. So this is one of the tools that our Red Hat services use. And then Kat's going to talk us about the other one.
So once you've kind of categorized your apps, the next thing is to look at the capabilities of your teams, and that's in regards to their ability to innovate and their readiness to adopt new technologies. There's 5 key areas to look at. The first is architecture. So this is kind of how you're doing your systems, and you want to move away from technical debt and more towards loosely coupled modular architectures. Automation, so how are your automation processes? And this is kind of moving away from manual steps and increasing things like self-service infrastructure. Ways of working, so this is how you're actually doing things, and this is more like moving towards agile approaches and looking at metrics and feedback loops. Then we've got the working environment, so this is the culture, looking at how you're doing things. And then leadership and vision, which is about the aspirations of your teams.
So we also, around leadership, it also covers things like how you decide how to make changes to an application. So you could be, for instance, making application changes based purely on a reactive thing, or someone's raised a bug, or this customer's saying they'll pay us some money to do this feature. So it's kind of how clever are you about the approach that you take with that.
And there's several ways. My microphone's gone funny. There's several ways that you can look at categorizing and looking at the capability levels. One approach we have is Red Hat's developed an open source tool. So again, this is not actually a Red Hat product. You can go on GitHub and download it if you search for RTI, which stands for Ready to Innovate. And basically what you do is you're presented with a page. The first page, you just enter in details about your team, names, those kind of things. And the next step is you get these 5 assessment areas that you can rate your teams between levels 1 to 5, where 5 is the most capable. And then you can click on it for more details. Step 4, there's some sliders. So the tool lets you to rate the capabilities of 2 kinds of teams. So you have development teams and operations teams. If you want to do more teams, you simply just run the tool again. And then there's some space for you to put notes in step 4. And then finally, the output is just to show you the comparisons between the 2 teams so you can see where they're aligned, and also to see the focus areas where you can prioritize your work on.
So not necessarily the 2 teams, but the 2 different skill types.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then so once you've got your application types, you can rank them according to the value and the effort. So you've got high value, low effort, all the way down to medium value, low effort, and you can rank these how you want. And then also you've got your team capabilities, and you can categorize these between forming, emerging, and leading. And then the idea is, where do you want to start with your application migration? You look at box number 1, so you're looking at your most capable teams, and then you want to look at the apps that they work on that are high value and low effort. And then the next kind of apps that you work on, you're going down to box 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. And that will then create your backlog of items for you to work on. So
the reason that we get the leading teams to start this work and we focus on those is because they're going to basically be starting with a sort of fresh sheet of paper in terms of the way that they do the way that you do adoption within your organization. And so you're expecting those guys to basically don't worry too much about any of the rough edges around the platforms that you're building and the approaches. They're setting the new standards and doing that kind of work. And so you're using those guys to be able to kind of lead the pack in a sense. And so what we typically see is this sort of circular iterative approach where we have the initial pilot apps that you've got coming from those leading teams, and those architectures, once they've gone through this process of transformation, and then effectively you've got a standard archetype then for other app teams that are doing similar types of applications. And so as part of that, you're developing this knowledge base within the organization. And so the reason that we'd recommend that you do it in this way, rather than sort of other sort of senses where we've seen some organizations where you'll get like a particular team that's leading and they'll go ahead and they'll do their own thing and they'll create some great things within the organization, is that often it's really difficult to replicate their work within the organization. So you kind of get these sort of unicorn teams or rock star developer teams doing some great work with containers and Kubernetes, but the rest of the organization is starts hating them because they're stuck in these horrible JEE monolith applications and they can't break out of that. They'd love to go and work on the new stuff, but they're stuck with this older stuff. And so this process is designed to enable an organization to have a kind of a comprehensive approach where they're bringing everybody up to speed rather than just a few pockets of excellence within the organization. So part of this is we also need to measure that work and make sure that the improvements that you're making are actually delivering something of value. So I don't know if people are familiar with things like the State of DevOps report, which is a Puppet Labs have got that report, and that was that's also if you want to read a book based on it, then I'd recommend the Accelerate book. So it's Forsgren, Humble, and Kim that wrote that book. And so they talk about these metrics that came out of the work that they were doing around DevOps. They surveyed hundreds of companies and looked at sort of low-performing and high-performing companies. And one of the things is that, you know, when we talked at the beginning, like the priorities of those companies that start out is that they want to do things more efficiently and quickly. And so we can look at measures which show us around, which tell us about the efficiency of the organization. So frequency and lead time help us identify that. But what they found in these reports after doing all of these assessments was that the companies that were high performing and low performing, those two factors, frequency and lead time, didn't differentiate them. So you had low performing companies that were performing really well. So they had like fast frequency, they had low lead times, so frequency in those two measures didn't differentiate between those two types of companies. What they did differentiate was on quality, and so they introduced the quality metrics to make sure that if you're, when you're tracking yourself against this, if you're increasing your frequency and reducing your lead time, you aren't doing that to the detriment of your quality. So you're maintaining quality or improving quality, but you're also getting faster along that. So if you're just not familiar, so frequency is essentially how often do we go through that delivery life cycle. So that could be a COTS product, it could be an application that you're developing, it could be an application that you're maintaining, yeah. But it still needs to go through that process of let's check that it's okay to go into release, essentially. The lead time is the time it takes to go from that development phase into production. So how long is it taking us to get into production? So, for instance, you could say the lead time on a bug may be, a few minutes, a few hours, a few weeks, depending on that kind of how performant your organization is. Quality, so we have fail percentage in production. So working in production is really important. So our quality measures are based on what's going on in production. So we're testing here how often we fail our applications in production. So how often is that problem going to happen? And of course, so that's showing us how the quality of the service. And then finally, we have the mean time to resolution. So if we do get a problem in production, then how quickly can we resolve that and get that up and running? Now, what's great about these metrics is they don't require anyone to be using containers or Kubernetes or any kind of technology. These metrics work across all types of delivery and types of IT. You could run this on mainframe applications if you wanted. And so what you're able to do is retrospectively develop these measures for your applications as they stand today. And then as you start doing your migration, then you're able to track those applications as you migrate them onto the platform. And so you should then see you are making improvements and not making things worse.
So the 4 key takeaways from this session is, the first one is to make sure you know your business reasons and you have a business case for doing the change. The second one, although technology is important, there's also other aspects that you should consider, including the people and the processes. It's good to have a strategy for how you're going to do adoption and then also to prioritize what you're doing. And the final one is to remain agile. So this is to take those small measurable pieces of work and then to focus on those business outcomes again. And I think that's it. We finished a bit early. So any questions?
I have 2 questions. First one is how many those kinds of services you did in your career, and where do you find your clients have got the biggest problems with when they migrate to containers or they change their technology?
Okay, so I've done quite a lot of. Personally, I've worked on quite a lot of with a lot of customers. I mean, containers and Kubernetes haven't been around that long, but Red Hat were kind of in the sort of from the 1.0 version of Kubernetes, and so it took a little bit of time for us to start recognizing those trends. But some of the ones that I've worked on were, and these are public references, so I can tell you about them. So one of them was Deutsche Bank. So I worked with them when they initially created their new Everything as a Service platform, and which is OpenShift and Kubernetes, plus other plugins and things like that they're using. So that was one of the ones I worked on, and let's have another one. Another public reference is an airport, which was Schiphol Airport. So they used OpenShift for their API gateway and other bits and pieces. There's a platform for that. Just trying to think of which ones are public and I can talk about and which ones aren't. Yeah, that's probably there's a car manufacturer as well that I've worked with, but we're actually working with about 3 or 4 big name car manufacturers at the moment on this. So, but what I was doing in my job for a couple of years was doing technical proof of concepts for customers. So we'd go in and we'd work with them to show them that they could take their application and put it into a container. And then what I did then is I developed within that role to be helping them understand kind of how they kind of position themselves. And so your second part of the question was kind of what are the blockers around that? And it's normally the shift from the organization and processes that they have that's geared up around their traditional infrastructure. And so if you think about kind of your traditional sort of VM type infrastructure that you might have that isn't very well automated and has high levels of orchestration, we would frequently go in and talk to customers and they would tell us that it takes us 3 weeks to provision a server. And so that has a chilling effect then on the way that you design your applications and the way that you interact with services. So you tend to see, developers will request more resources than they need. Or we need a dev environment, we need a test environment, we need staging and production, and we need all of these servers to be provisioned. The servers tend to get reused. So initially it was supposed to be the front end, and then it became a sort of a middleware back end type server, and they kind of, depending on which stage it is, it may get just updated and updated, so there's no kind of, no one really really knows what state that application server is at. And so that was kind of an issue that we see. And so then when we moved to bringing them with a container platform where you can essentially go to the platform and say, can I have some resources? Can you run this application? And can you suddenly scale it up? And I can do that like this in something like Kubernetes. You had a problem because the applications weren't designed to scale. They were like designed to be one size fits all. And so there was often changes that you need to make there. And then from an infrastructure perspective, the infrastructure teams were like, yeah, but we need to maintain all of that control that we used to have. We want to, if we don't want the developers just to go and consume resources, they need to come to us and ask nicely, and then we might give it to them. And so we kind of have those sorts of problems. And so those are often kind of those challenges that we have to overcome in landing and successfully adopting the platform. There's has anyone heard of Conways Law? One person's heard of Conways Law. Oh, no, a couple of them. Yeah, so you know about this, right? So this is particularly appropriate for organizations that are attempting to adopt DevOps principles. And so we often go into an organization and go, yeah, we're trying to change. We know we're doing things wrong, and we want to be better, but we keep coming up with the same answer. And that's sort of Conway's Law, is that organizations are destined to design systems which follow their existing communication patterns. And we see that quite often. One of the things that Red Hat did to help kind of break people out from things like that was that we run, so traditionally the way we run our services is services go on site with a customer and work with the customer and help them, we're kind of like SMEs or, experts on a particular technology, and we'll sort of say, oh no, this is do it this way, you do it that way, I'd recommend this, I'd do that. And we sort of help them in that journey. But that suffers from that issue where we're still working within the scope of that organization. And so one of the things that we've done to help break out of that is with our Red Hat Open Innovation Labs, where we run residencies, where instead of us going to the customer comes to us, and we do 6 to 12 week residencies where they come and work with us, and we kind of show them, like, this is how you do it using agile principles and using DevOps and fun and silliness, and that's been a really successful way of getting teams to kind of break out of their kind of traditional approaches and drive and laser focus then on a particular business outcome and deliver that business outcome.
And then I've done some more work with customers going in to specifically look at their strategy in business, so not just focusing on the technology side of things. And so this is bringing in senior leaders, IT, business people, product owners, different people, just to get them all on board with what we're doing and try to make sure everyone's aligned with the business outcomes that they're having. And then looking at some of those key areas I mentioned, so for example, automation. Sometimes you'll talk to developers and operations team, and you'll see in their development environment, they're fine, they've got things automated, they're using source control, but then when it comes to testing, there's massive delays because they're using shared environments with other teams. You can't just go in and change a database setting, you need to get permission from another team to do this. And so actually integration testing is a real blocker. So it's just looking at the different processes in place and how people are working together, as we're saying, not just the technology, the rest of it matters as well. And I think that's one of the key areas that people need to be looking at more.
Yeah, automation across the software development lifecycle is quite tricky. The biggest issue that we get with legacy applications and automating and moving towards things like continuous delivery tends to be testing and the test automation. So they may be doing unit tests, but they typically don't automate beyond that. And so that's often a bit of a challenge, is trying to ramp up that testing and having strategies around the testing.
Okay. Do you have some more questions? Okay, there's a question.
Have you ever advised or would advise a customer not to use containers?
Oh yeah, yes.
What would be the case?
So so the application that we've got, that Pathfinder application that we use. So sometimes you have a number. So it's very common for cloud companies to have all these different classifications. They all begin with RE. So it's like rehost, refactor, whatever, replatform. And so one of them is remain, so they or retire. So you just basically leave it alone. And so if you have an application which is has a lot of technical debt, maybe is just in maintenance, and it's not something that you want to invest in, then those aren't necessarily good candidates for moving stuff across. It might be better to leave that alone and use patterns. So we have these sort of techniques like the strangler pattern, which is one of them, where you leave that application alone and then you start creating new microservices which replace elements of that original application. And slowly you kind of reduce the scope of that original legacy application, and then everything now is in microservices. But that obviously takes a bit of time. So that approach can happen. We worked with, this is a public reference. We worked with Volvo on, so Volvo have, they have like imagine like a wiki with case management tool. So for all of their engineers in their garages who are having to, change a cam belt or something like that in a car, they can go to a system and they can look up like how to do that and do case management on that particular change. And the old system was had a lot of technical debt and problems with it, so they decided to basically create a brand new system. And so they did that. This is one of the things that they did with our Open Innovation Labs. And so Volvo spoke at our summit in Boston earlier this year about that, and showed that looking at some of those sorts of metrics that we showed on the board, how they were able to go from lead times of multiple weeks to 1 or 2 days for delivering new features into the platform through that approach. But that was interesting because whilst they took a new they basically created a brand new application, the process still had to stay the same. And so what they did was they mapped out, so they did this sort of metrics-based measurement of the events, the whole process for collecting information and then recording information and updating the system. That process originally stayed the same, and then they slowly improved it and automated whole swathes of that application. So you just had the business deciding a new change, and then all automated to it being available to its end users.
And just to add as well, it's what we were saying about if it's high value, high effort, look at those factors, and then also who's actually using it. Sometimes customers will get a list of apps that they have in their organisation, then they don't even know who's using it, and then you're like, well, just turn it off, see if anyone complains, and if no one complains, they forget about it as well. So there's a whole load of factors to consider.